We saw Homer and then Hesiod with the myths. What comes after that would be the Milesian school, which is Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes. But we might as well just follow the order of the book. It's skipping the chronological order, but it actually makes a little bit more sense because we just, in terms of the ideas, because we just finished talking about the myths and polytheism and anthropomorphic polytheism, right? I think it's pretty clear, as we're going to see here, the way that he reasoned, when he was in his 90s, apparently, to the existence of one God is by arguing against there being many gods. The way he reasoned to God being spiritual is arguing against God having a body and having, bodily actions and so on. So this will be pretty clear here. Now, just as in general with the pre-Socratics, notice we only have fragments. So for pretty much everyone in this whole book, we only have fragments of their works. Actually, for everyone in the whole book, we don't have any entire work of any pre-Socratic. Sometimes the fragments may be a large part of what they wrote, perhaps. Other times not. But so that's one thing. Now, on one level, that just makes it easier because there's just not much text to read. But it also makes it challenging because you have to try to piece together what they were saying, right? Maybe based on just one or two fragments, and then there's all the testimonies. So it's divided up first into the fragments and then into testimonies. Right? You can see the fragments are in italics, and the testimonies can certainly shed light on the fragments. But it kind of depends. You'll notice sometimes the testimonies don't agree with each other. It's because, they were in the same boat that we are. They didn't even in the ancient world, maybe the works had been lost by then. And so they're trying to figure out what the person was saying. But still, there might be details that aren't clear, but the big picture is usually pretty clear based on the fragments. Okay, so we saw last time, number one, God is one supreme among gods and men. So certainly, that's the divine unicity, meaning divine oneness. And that kind of language where you have God and then right next to it you have the gods with a lowercase g, that's pretty much always how it is for Greek monotheists. So they don't have that strict use of the term God like in Judaism and Christianity, where we restrict as much as possible, We restrict it. Now we always do, but even in the Bible, most of the time they restrict the word God to God with a capital G. Sometimes they will mention God with a lowercase g, but in a negative way, typically.
But the Greek word for God, capital G, is the same as Greek word for God, lowercase g?
So the way that it's what we put as a capital G God in Greek is literally, it's the God is how it's written.
Okay. Got it.
So the word the, Greek has the word the, it's ha, and then, so that's, whenever you have God with capital G, this is a transition of ha theos.
Monotheism.
And by the way, that's the same thing in the New Testament.
Got it.
So it'll say, in the beginning was the word was God. When it talks about God, it always says ha theos, meaning the God, literally. So they don't use the capital. This is what it looks like in Greek. I think it's like that. But
Okay.
So that's how it
Got
works.
it.
So number two, divine simplicity, he doesn't have eyes and ears and a mouth and a nose, It is the whole of God that sees, the whole of God that thinks and hears, So God thinks, God is a mind. That's also very important, So he's not just something that we can't define. He's a mind. So he's taking, things that were in the polytheism and then removing any anthropomorphism. Without effort, he sets everything in motion by the thought of his mind. So a later pre-Socratic, there really aren't many that are monotheists. Most of them are actually materialists or pantheists and so on. But Anaxagoras is a later one, and he always calls God mind with the capital M. Once again, the mind is how they would say that in Greek. There's a divine mind. Number four, he always abides in the self-same place, not moving at all. it is not appropriate to his nature to be in different places at different times. So he's not, right, it's not like Zeus is up on Mount, whatever, Olympus, and then he decides to like go down and see what's going on, and then he goes here and he goes there. No, like he doesn't move from place to place. So that's the idea of omnipresence, that he's everywhere. He doesn't have to travel around. Let's see, Eric, do you want to read number 5 on page 33?
But mortals suppose that the gods have been born, that they have voices and bodies, and wear clothing like men.
Okay, so, right, this is, these numbers, basically numbers 7 to 8 are kind of against anthropomorphism and polytheism. Right, so we suppose that, now notice here even the gods, because he does mention gods in the plural, so the way that they're viewing it is there's an immaterial God, and then whatever gods there may be underneath him, they're also immaterial. That's going to be the same, whether it's Xenophanes, Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, and also some of the Stoics. Well, the Stoics aren't always on the same page. Okay. Good.
If oxen or lions had hands which enable them to draw and paint pictures as men do, they would portray their gods as heavy bodies like their own. Horses would portray them as horses, and oxen as oxen.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? We're just making the Greeks were just making the gods in their own image, giving them, human appearance.
Ethiopians have gods with snub noses and black hair. Thracians have gods with gray eyes and red hair.
So the anthropomorphism.
You want me to read 8? Homer and Hesiod attributed to the gods all sorts of actions, which, when done by men, are disreputable and deserving of blame, such lawless deeds as theft, adultery, and mutual deception.
Okay, so what's his criticism there, and then what would he be saying by God then, about God?
I think the criticism is kind of a anthropomorphism where, because we see these wicked deeds in men, that the ancients were projecting them onto the gods, whereas God wouldn't be fickle, evil.
Right. So by way of contrast, he's saying, God isn't going to be deceitful,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you have this omnipotent being, he's not going to be deceiving. I mean, how would that even why would he even need to do that? So this is God's. He's truthful, right? He's good. He's not evil. But basically, right? They do these things that are evil, like adultery, right? Kidnapping people. All kinds of things we saw, right? And so he's saying, no, he should be good. He shouldn't be this capricious being that's like doing evil things.
So in the back doorway, like omnibenevolence as well.
Right. So the divine benevolence or goodness, truthfulness, right? And notice he's just getting this by reasoning against what the polytheists are saying against what the Greek myths are saying about God or the divine, about divine beings. He's saying he shouldn't be like that. Next, or actually, why don't you just go to number 10? So he also had. There's various themes here. There's number 9 is about the limits of human knowledge, which certainly he could mean that just about God himself, right? Like most people have a very flawed view of the gods, and he could mean that also in an empirical sense, right? Like we don't really understand much about the natural world.
What came first? Someone creating the gods that we don't know, or poets talking about it and creating these gods?
So basically, what's the origin of it? The origin would seem to be like ancient kings. If you think about it, Zeus and Hera, they're like a king and a queen, right? I mean, in what is it, Mycenaean, right? So the Mycenaean kind of pre-Greek period, like that's when the Trojan War took place, the Mycenaean period. Maybe there was some ancient king named Zeus, like from the Titans to the Greek gods. I always thought that's so strange. Like, why are there all these Titans, and then why did the Greek gods like rebel against them? Like, instead, why not just go straight from, the earth and the sky, or to the gods? Why have this Titan state? Well, that could be an ancient kind of dynastic war where there was one dynasty and then there was another dynasty that overthrew it. So these would be echoes of that. And then basically, there's of course, the book by Tolkien. How many of you guys know Tolkien, Lord of the Rings? If you don't know it, it's probably one of the major novels. It's certainly the major fantasy novel of the 20th century, but probably just one of the major novels across the board in English language. But he was Catholic, which is kind of exceptional in England, right? Catholics are a very small minority in England. Anyway, in Lord of the Rings, he was a fairly devout Catholic too. So it does have kind of a good message to it. And in the film version, at the beginning, right at the beginning, they say, history became legend, legend became myth. Now, I don't know if he says that in the Lord of the Rings itself, because it's a trilogy, it's 3 volumes. But he certainly is aware of that because he was a philologist, so studying ancient languages, like the Lord of the Rings has like Old Norse in it, it has Icelandic, it has all these like forgotten Northern European languages that he used. So there's more going on in it than just on the surface. But people who research that have found that out. But so right at the beginning, if you ever watched the first one, it's called The Fellowship of the Ring. It says history became legend, legend became myth. So from the history of great kings and then them king being overthrown, that became legendary. So legendary features start to accrue. Now they're fighting dragons and fighting monsters, right? That's typical. Perseus and Theseus, if you know about them, they're a bit more legendary. And then finally, legend became myth, where now it's just Zeus is a god on Mount Olympus who's immortal. But if you think about his behavior, I mean, I hate to say it, but stuff you guys might hear about in the confessional, right? The whole sexual misbehavior stuff. I'm sure you're going to confession because it's. Our Lady of Fatima said, "More souls go to hell for sin to the flesh in front of the reason." I mean, so I'm sure you're going to hear about it. So be ready. I don't know, however you guys and pray the rosary in there or something. But like a CEO of a company, I mean, I've read books on psychology where CEO of a company, there was some CEO of a company who basically serially took advantage of the woman employees, and many of them, not one or two, very large numbers that I will not tell you to not drag that in. But see what I mean? Of course, if you hear someone in confession, maybe you'll encounter something like that. But you see what I mean? That's kind of what Zeus is like. He's the king. He's the big man and on the totem pole. And so you could see how for someone in a position of power, it's easy for them to start maybe taking advantage of people. And then that's kind of how he acts, right? He acts like the CEO of this company that I've read about in the psychology book, where he was serially basically taking advantage. And it's an extremely vicious behavior, but right. So if you're the king, is the woman what is she gonna do? Report you to the law? Well, the king is the law, right? I mean, in a monarchy, the king is what is it? His word is law, isn't that's the whole monarchy idea, right? So there's no accountability for him because in quis custodet ipsos custodes is saying in Latin, right? Who guards the guardians themselves? If you're the one in charge, there's no one you're accountable to. So that's, see what I mean? When you look at it from that perspective, once again, it's very illuminating about human nature, about even fallen human nature. So that's what I think would be the origin of the myth. The history became legend, and legend became myth. Because remember, with Zeus, it's weird. He's supposed to be this immortal god, and yet he was born. What was it in Crete? Well, I don't know why he's a god and he's born in Crete. That doesn't make sense. Well, maybe he was a Cretan king from 2000 BC who eventually was turned into a hero, and so on and so forth. So, and actually, I mean, honestly, that was just my own reasoning about it after, like I said, making the comparisons to the CEO and the behavior, right? Because, right, the serial behavior, that kind of thing. And then, but then I was looking at, apparently in Augustine's book, The City of God, he makes a similar point. He says, the gods are based on ancient kings. So I guess in the ancient world, they were able to figure that out. Of course, they're living in that. And if you know, I'm not a specialist on Hinduism by a very large stretch, but in Hinduism, it starts off with a big battle. And they think that goes back to an invasion from the north. That battle, in 1000 BC, lost in history and time, right? And then that's where they got their gods from, right? They took that battle and then it became legendary and finally mythical. Okay, so he obviously isn't saying any of that, but what he is saying is, well, there's something divine, but it can't be polytheistic, it can't be anthropomorphic, it can't be corrupt, it can't be deceitful. And you can see there is a certain inner logic to that, right? Like, who would God want to deceive? Like, if he knows everything, why would he want to deceive us? Why would he make us if he could deceive us? Like, it doesn't seem to make sense. Okay, so number 2, basically the fallibility of human knowledge. So some people, number 10, some people will read number 10 and say, well, he's a skeptic. Well, no, I don't think he's a skeptic. I think he's just talking about the society he's living in. So let's read number 10.
No man has existed, nor will exist, who has plain knowledge about the gods and the questions I discuss. For even if someone happened by chance to say what is true, he still would not know that he did so, yet everybody thinks he knows.
Right, so in a sense, by chance they say what's true. They say, well, Zeus is the father of justice. Zeus punishes the wrongdoer. Because remember, there's that strain of Zeus. There's the Zeus who's the I don't know, sexual predator CEO. There's the Zeus who's the punishing the evildoer, right? I mean, they're both there in the myths. And so when they say, Zeus, who's the right highest god for them, punishes the evildoer, so now he's going to be like, well, yeah, that would make sense. God is good, right? He would do that in whatever way, right? Some idea of providence, right? But they don't actually understand what they're saying, because in their mind, they really think Zeus is a guy with a beard who has children and who's fathered children and so on and so forth. So they think they know what they're talking about when they say the truth, but they actually don't. So it's kind of the plight. You have a little bit of empathy for Xenophanes here. It's the plight of the first person to kind of discover monotheism that we know about outside of any Hebrew influence. Because of course the Jews knew about God, but that was because it was revealed to them, right? They didn't. It wasn't a vacuum like this. He says, no one has existed nor will exist, right? So he basically thinks there's not much, this isn't going to catch on. And he was basically right, because, as I've said, right, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle were philosophical monotheists, but it didn't catch on. It was just, they were aware of that. There's busts of Socrates that are all over the ancient world. He was considered very noble. They admired him for teaching virtue, but it never caught on and became like a popular thing. There was always kind of the eccentric philosophers or people who agreed with him, but it was never really popular. And what made it popular was actually Christianity. So it took divine intervention to actually make monotheism just actually permeate the whole culture. And even then, it took a long time, as you guys know. It took 280 years. So he is kind of right about that when he says, humanly speaking, it never did catch on. Okay, number 11. Ryan?
I'm sorry. These things have seemed to me resemblances of what is true.
Okay.
If God had not created yellow honey, men would regard figs as sweeter than thou.
All right, so that's the idea of creation. Now, he doesn't say, oh, God created everything out of nothing. There's nothing sophisticated like that. But just say that, no, it's not, who was it? Prometheus who made humans. That's the funny thing, too, with the Greek myths. Like, for us, well, God made man, right? But for them, it's not even Zeus or Hera who made humans. It's Prometheus, who is not even one of the gods. He's one of the titans that he gets in trouble for helping humans out, too. Remember? So see, there's a lot of confusion about the divine here. There's like antagonism. So here, no, he's like, if God had not created honey, men would regard figs. This is a passing comment, but it shows you a sense of creation and of providence. That he gave us honey because it's sweet. So it's, once again, very impressive that, I guess when someone is 92 years old, what they can reason to. Okay? And then now he switches into, so what's very interesting about him as well is he's not just the first one to do natural theology, but he also is talking about nature as well, doing some natural philosophy. Okay?
All things come from the earth, and they reach their end by returning to the earth at last.
Okay, now this is why, if we had read him after Thales, you'd have a bit more context for that. So Thales, excuse me, it basically said that everything is made of water, right? There's 4 elements: fire, earth, air, and water. And so Thales thought, well, there must be some one basis for everything. So let's say it's water. And Xenophanes, who's a little bit later than Thales, here is saying, well, maybe everything's made of earth. Everything's made of earth. So he picks earth. Okay.
Whatever comes to be and grows is earth and water.
Probably referring to like plants, so living things, which is true that living things require water. I mean, that's, okay.
We are all sprung from earth and water.
Right. So he's not just doing philosophical theology, he's also talking about nature, which is, very interesting in its own right. Okay.
What we see of the earth is its upper limit, where it is in contact with the air. It goes downward to infinity.
So what would the basis of the earth be? I mean, I don't know what to say about that. That's what the fragment says. Okay, number 17, Timothy.
The sea is the source of water and the source of wind. For blast of my wind could not come to be within the clouds and blow forth from them, if it were not for the great sea. Nor could there be rivers, nor any rain from the sky without it. The great sea is the begetter of clouds and winds and rivers.
Anybody? Does that sound right? What would we call that? Anybody nowadays?
Meteorology.
Right. Who's that? Exactly. That's the water cycle. So see, things that you might think like the Renaissance narrative, or really the modern narrative with like Galileo, is like, or the narrative is that the ancients really didn't know anything. It was just all imagination. Well, no. I mean, here we see the pre-Socratics. They're not just the first philosophers; they're the first scientists. Because up until quite recently, up until about 250 years ago, science was just called natural philosophy. That's right. Newton's work is called the Principles of Natural Philosophy, and it's quite accurate, right? So what we call the scientific method of observing things and finding out their natural causes, that didn't start with Galileo and Descartes and Isaac Newton, right? That's predates it by several thousand years, and they themselves would acknowledge that. Certainly Isaac Newton would, and some of them were well aware of that and acknowledged it. Others less so. But so what this tells you, he's the first person to speak of the water cycle. I mean, I know, and they teach it in elementary school. They should include that. They should say, well, we're going to teach about the water cycle. And by the way, Xenophanes in 580 BC was the first person to become aware of this. So see, the reason I'm making this point is that the narrative tends to be religious people are anti-science, right? Religion. This is the so-called Enlightenment, right? Of the 1800s, people like Voltaire and so on, the moderns, and they'll say, well, religion is basically superstition, and then science is how we know about nature. So talking about God is just superstition. Materialists, at least, will say that, certainly, right? And so, and that's quite common nowadays. And here we see, well, he's both talking about God and he's interested in science. So even the first person who discovered the water cycle, and reason to it, was also the first person to talk about there being one God who's good. So you see, what that lets us know is it's a false opposition that materialism is making when they say that any kind of religious belief is superstition and it's irrational. And if you were scientific and rational, you wouldn't buy into that. Well, here Xenophanes is a great counterexample to that, showing that no, there's no need to make that opposition, right? I can use reason to talk about the natural world, and I can use reason to talk about God. So, okay, of course, this is just the beginning of that. But and then number 19, Matthew.
She whom men call iris rainbow is a cloud of such nature as to cause appearances of violet, red, and yellow green.
So what's he saying there?
The water, like the prism of light, essentially, like.
So is the rainbow then? What is he?
Oh, he's
as
saying.
far as like the goddess, or I don't know if she's a goddess or a nymph.
Yeah, it's a natural.
I think she was a goddess. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of fluid, with those beings sometimes. Go ahead.
Oh, he's just saying that that's a natural occurrence. It's-
Right. So this is the mythos versus logos idea, right? Not the imaginary explanation, but the natural cause. And once again, not to downplay the value of the myths as literature, right? It is a beautiful imagery, right? To think of a woman inside the tree called a dryad, right? And that's fine. If in the Renaissance they would make paintings of that, like we're not. Catholicism has never been like fundamentalist. It has never been like saying you should just destroy everything. That's not Catholicism, right? So that's fine, but that's it's like a fairy tale. It's not right reality. Someone else?
And just a quick clarifying question. I noticed here when he's referring to the rainbow, he only lists a few colors. My understanding of this is that language didn't necessarily have terms for all the colors.
Yeah, there's a whole big thing about that. I mean, I have an article on that. I could email you if you want. Just email me and I'll send it to you. Because basically it's somewhat exaggerated. They'll say, oh, Greek didn't have a word for blue because Homer talks about the wine dark sea. But then there's a classist. I mean, I don't specialize in Greek per se. I have an article by a classicist where he's basically saying, like, no, they had a word for blue. They had a word for yellow. What it is, it's very pithy, right? I mean, these are fragments. And also just, it's very pithy. Pithy means you're trying to say a lot in a few words. So he's not like, well, that we call it, it's also, by the way, he was a poet. So these are all poetry. We didn't read the introductions. Let's see. But he was a poet, that's the point. So these are in verse, you know what I mean? So the poetry doesn't read well if you just list everything. So that's why he's not listing them. Okay. I wonder if we should read some of the introduction, or did you guys already read that? You already read it? Okay. Yeah, because the introduction is really excellent. Right, page 31. He's the first critical theologian. I'll just summarize it then. I can talk you to it. Right, instead of he calls it a critical theologian, meaning not based on religion, but based on reason. He talks about how he was exiled from his native city. It's possible he could have been exiled if he was critical of the myths. Like, remember, saying Iris, the rainbow is not Iris, that's not really acceptable because the religion says it is Iris, right? So he certainly could have been exiled, and that's what happened to Pythagoras, as we'll see later. Pythagoras was exiled.
Just a clarification, like most of these philosophers would have been writing in verse like their literary counterparts, like a Homer, like
Not
that,
necessarily most of them. No, not most of them. That's more the minority.
Okay.
So part of the beginning of prose is with philosophy, because most of them are writing in prose.
Okay.
So he's an exception, yeah.
Gotcha.
He's one of the few who's a poet, but he's also doing science, as you can see. So yeah.
Gotcha.
I'm trying to think if there's anyone who comes to mind. Parmenides. Parmenides is called the poem Parmenides. And then Empedocles Empedocles definitely wrote in verse. Even though it's called the poem Parmenides, I'm not sure if it's actually in verse. But Xenophanes, Parmenides, and Empedocles are in verse, but the other ones aren't. Okay, like Anaxagoras, for example. At one time, he was teacher to Parmenides. There it is, on the middle of page 31, of Alea. Many historians have classified Xenophanes as an Eleatic, but Eleaticism, chapter 4, stands for an unqualified metaphysical monism. So that's the idea we're going to see in Parmenides, that everything is just being. Xenophanes, on the other hand, was not a monist, but a monotheist. And the surviving fragments don't show any interest in metaphysical questions. He doesn't even mention the word being. So this is very helpful because even in the ancient world, people thought, well, if Xenophanes taught Parmenides, their ideas must be the same, because, right? And no, like he does a good job on that. Xenophanes doesn't say that all being is one, and that plurality is impossible, as Parmenides would do. But he confines himself to proclaim the doctrine of God as single and transcendent. Why don't we, since we see the word monism, why don't we look at the definition sheet for a minute? That I did monism and pluralism. Let's read that. So on page 4, and I have compare introduction, page 13 to 14, which is also very excellent. But for now, let's just read the definition. Maybe we can come back to that later. Gerald, do you want to read?
Monism versus tourism. With the founder. Monism, the reality is based on only one kind of first principle. Materialist, Thales, water.
It's pronounced Thales.
Thales, water, all three Milesians, and metaphysical,
So that's Parmenides.
Parmenides being.
Okay, so that's, see, you just mentioned metaphysical monism. Metaphysical monism, I did everything is being, as we'll see in chapter 4. Thales, as we'll see after this, right? Everything is made of water, but I did mention that. So monism is just everything is basically one kind of thing. Okay, and next one, number 2.
Pluralism, reality is based on more than one first principle. Materialist, Empedocles,
Or yeah, they're all Empedocles or Democritus.
qualitative, Empedocles, 4
Good.
elements, and then repeat, Democritus.
Democritus usually has that. Some people could say Democritus. I mean, there's some variability. Okay.
And atoms and mathematical,
Pythagoras.
Numbers.
Okay, so this is, as far as the Pre-Socratics are concerned, the way to divide them up, following page 13 of the book. So there's monist and there's pluralist. So materialist pluralism, Empedocles, instead of picking one element, like water for Thales or earth for Xenophanes, he says everything is just made of all 4 elements. So that's quite a bit further on, reacting against the earlier Pre-Socratics. And then reified, to reify something means to turn it into a thing. Into a thing. Because the Greek word, the Latin word res means thing. That's where we get our word reality. So what he's saying is that instead of just being 4 elements, there's these little things called atoms, which is basically what we nowadays agree with. So also, yes, when they teach chemistry, they should, sometimes they may do it, but yes, the textbooks would say, absolutely, right? The first person to come with the idea of atoms was Democritus in 400 BC. And then mathematical, Pythagoras focuses on numbers, like numbers are how you explain things. So, okay, so that's the monism pluralism. So back to page 31. Right, he says Xenophanes is very modern in his opposition to anthropomorphism. I would say he's very rational in opposing anthropomorphism. Right, his discoveries are more reliable than revelations. So you could see, I mean, Wheelwright is a secularist, right? Because I would not use the word revelation there. I would use the word mythology, right? I'm using the word revelation for the Bible. Right? Only the Bible is, at least with the capital R, revelation, as opposed to mythology. On page 32, right, if God is divine and worthy of human worship, he must be superior and not inferior to man. And therefore, in some sense, he must know and be aware. So see, he's giving you the underlying reasoning. What can be challenging about Xenophanes, it's just these statements, right? It's just these fragments. Plus, remember, they're in his poetry, so it's not like he wrote a treatise about this. But that is, right, the underlying reasoning, right? Remember, God shouldn't be inferior to us. Why would we worship him, right? So therefore, he must know and be aware he's a mind, right? But then also he must have goodness and truth. Xenophanes accepting this conclusion stipulates that at any rate, God's knowledge and awareness are not intermittent and effortful, as in the case of mortals. So it's not like he's like going to sleep. I remember in Elijah, the story of Elijah, where he's like, oh, maybe he's taking a Val. Maybe he's taking a nap, or maybe he's like off, I don't know, doing some work or something, fixing his fence. Right, so that's the same kind of thing. Isaiah is being a little bit of a philosopher, right? He's using reason. He's like, well, is it really reasonable? Because Baal, they're also anthropomorphic, right? That's the norm, is anthropomorphic polytheism. Remember God's knowledge words are not intermittent, so it's not like he takes naps, and effortful, and that he's trying to figure things out. Right? He's trying to purify it of all those human characteristics. But are instantaneous, perpetual, and a property of his whole being rather than produced by parts and organs. Now he doesn't, as I said, he doesn't use the word being, but you get the idea, right? Spiritual. Here, preserved for posterity in only 2 fragments, is a record of the first known case in the West of a clear grasp of the problem of divine knowledge. Right. So, and then he says his criticisms, right. Well, yeah. Going forward, we'll see how you can compare him to the extreme monism of Parmenides. So the difference between him and Parmenides. Huh?
Regarding the phrase, God's knowledge and awareness are not intermittent and effortful, could that also mean like he doesn't necessarily think, but he just instantaneously, because like thinking is kind of an effort and a process. So instead of like, you could even say the conceptual understandings and often it has of God, he just instantaneously comprehends all concepts.
Yeah, I mean, and number 3, right? Without effort, he sets everything in motion by the thought of his mind, right? If he's setting everything in motion, then it would imply that he also kind of understands everything, right? That he doesn't have limits. So yeah. Okay, on page 34, the elegiac reflections. So here, you can see kind of the poetic side of him. Let's look up page 35. Men who are about. Derek.
Men who are about to make merry should first honor the gods with hymns composed of well-told tales and pure words.
Okay, so notice, this is what I'm, so my term for this, I just call this inclusive monotheism, that the way we use the word God is exclusive. We just, there's God, there's angels, so we have a different word for other spiritual beings. The way that they're doing it is there's God, and then there's the gods who are beneath him. And we're going to see this when we read Socrates as well. So he's not saying we should just get rid of the Greek religion. They're saying we should purify it and get rid of the bad things about it. Okay?
After they have poured a libation and have prayed for the power to do what is right, that indeed is the first business in hand, then there is nothing wrong in drinking as much as a man can hold without having to be taken home by a servant, unless of course he is very old.
Right, so it's pretty funny. So, right, I mean, interesting, the idea of this is natural religion, right? Like divine assistance, you should pray, you should ask God for help, right? There's nothing wrong with drinking, and then moderation, temperance, right? You shouldn't engage in drunkenness. If you're very old, you might need help because you're old, but, okay?
The man to be praised is he who, after drinking, can still express thoughts that are noble and well-arranged. But let him not repeat those old hackneyed tales of titans or giants or centaurs, nor those of violent civil broils. There's nothing to be gained from all that. But it is always good to give heedful reverence to the gods.
Right, so see, purifying it. Like, don't talk about titans and giants. Like, that's all just myth. Nor violent, the gods fighting with each other. Rather so he's trying to purify it, you see, rather than get rid of it. Similar at the bottom of the page, right? If someone's wisdom is superior to strength and speed of men or horses, then that's what really matters, not that Ares is very strong and Zeus is, whatever, throwing his lightning bolts. Popular opinion misjudges these matters. It does wrong in prizing strength above wisdom. So that's something that's common with the pre-Socratics in general, right? Trying to focus on wisdom and knowledge, which is different from what you have in Homer, right? Because in Homer, the heroes are good warriors. And we already read number 24 on the next page. Then like number 23, once again, against vanity, in favor of moderation. So there's obviously, there's an ethical side to the pre-Socratics as well, right? I just don't focus on that as much because we're focusing more on like metaphysical and kind of bigger speculative questions with theoretical philosophy. Okay. So the testimonies, that's where you can see some of them. That's why it is important to read that introduction, because many people took him as, they said, well, because Parmenides is a student, he must be teaching the same thing as Parmenides. So some of the testimonies, you can see that in them. But let's read T6, testimony 6 on page 38. Christian?
So sorry.
That's okay. Page 38.
T6?
Yeah.
Xenophanes assumes that what comes to be must come from what already is. Further, he holds that God is supreme, by which he means most powerful and best. This goes against the customary opinion, which regards some gods as superior to others in various respects.
Right. So whereas Zeus may be he's most powerful, but then he's not as good of a smith as Hephaestus and so on. Right. You're just saying God is qualitatively different from the other ones. Next, T7.
On the supposition that God is supreme over all things, Xenophanes draws the conclusion that God is one.
And by the way, notice it says pseudo-Aristotle. I'm not 100% sure if it's pseudo or not. There are a couple of Aristotle's the works that are you can actually pretty much prove that they were written by Aristotle. For this one, I'm not sure. I'm kind of on the fence. I'd want to see actual proof that it wasn't by Aristotle. Like, there's a manuscript that refers to some other author or something like that. Okay.
For if there were two or more gods, each of them would be supreme, and thus, in effect, none of them would be supreme and best.
So this is a very good argument against polytheism, right? Okay.
For the very meaning of God and of divine power involves supremacy over all else. So far as he is not superior, he is not God.
So that's the kind of reasoning you could use against there being many gods. That if there really needs to be one God who is not contending with the other one, not fighting with them, and disagreeing with them, and so on. And right, that's true of polytheism in general. That the gods are portrayed as not getting along at times. Okay. So I think that's good for Xenophanes, the big picture. So let's go on to the horizontal end. So, and once again, with this is why you kind of need to read the same way that like one fragment illuminates another. In this monotheistic tradition, different thinkers illuminate the other ones. Because you might still be like, well, it's not that clear. He didn't really give any arguments. Well, now about 200 years later, or maybe 150 years later, Socrates is going to address the issue of God. And you're going to notice it's the same kind of reasoning, except for he is kind of unpacking the argument. He is, he's expressing the underlying reasoning, okay? And then even more so than with Plato and Aristotle, where Aristotle, it's actually a sophisticated natural theology that fits into his whole metaphysics. But with Socrates here, it's certainly much more, there's much more to it. It's much more robust, basically, than just a couple of fragments from Xenophanes. But you see, having just read Xenophanes, you can see, right? This isn't in a vacuum. Like, oh, Socrates just, wow, he managed to figure all this stuff out about God. Well, no, he's building on Xenophanes. And the thing is that actually there's at least one other person who would have taught the same thing that we don't have any fragments of, who's mentioned. So there actually could be a lot more texts on this monotheism topic, but this is only what we have. This is right the fragments from Xenophanes and then this text from Socrates, also Anaxagoras. But okay, so now obviously we're jumping into Socrates after the pre-Socratics. But since it's on the same topic, so and he's going to say a lot more too about how we relate to God. Also keeping the kind of inclusive monotheism idea where there's God with a capital G and there's still the gods, but they're not anthropomorphic. Let's see, who's next? Matthew? So do you want to read the first full paragraph on the Now God was not. So otherwise you might be like, wait a minute, where's this? Where's God coming from here? Like, he's not Jewish, right? Like, how did he discover about God? See, Xenophanes was the first one. Independently of Xenophanes, the only other person, did I already mention Akhenaten? So the other person, he's on the chronology in the Verto handout. About 1300 BC, there was a pharaoh called Akhenaten who was kind of talked about one God, but it wasn't really full monotheism because we'll read that in Why don't we read the lecture notes before we get into the next sentence? So let's look at the definition sheet. And Matthew, do you want to read 7 attributes? Page 5.
7 attributes of God for Exophanes. Number 1, no multiplicity. 2, omnipotent, all powerful. 3, immaterial, not material in any way. 4, omniscient, all knowing. 5, omnipresent, present everywhere. 6, eternal, no beginning or end. 7, simplicity, no composition of parts. Whole of him is active. A, also truth, goodness, creation, providence.
Okay, so we just saw those in various fragments. Okay, read lecture.
Polytheism versus henotheism versus monotheism. Polytheism. Belief in many gods without an omnipotent God. Often has some kind of God. For example,
some king.
Often has some king god. For example, Zeus, Odin. More powerful than the rest of the pantheon, yet remains anthropomorphic, etc. For example, Greek, Norse, Chinese mythologies. Number 2, henotheism. One higher God, who is superior but similar to the lower, did not necessarily create them, not necessarily omniscient, etc. I.e., may lack attributes 2 to 6 below.
Oh, it should say above.
Oh, sorry.
Because that's referring to the one from Xenophanes. Okay.
For example, Akhenaten, worship only sun god / Aten, yet mentions Ra as Aten's father.
Right. So see, so henotheism is the idea that it's not just polytheism. Like there's a god who stands out more than the other ones. But for example, so people say, well, Akhenaten was a monotheist. Some people thought that sometimes, right? But really, I mean, so he was wanted to focus on Aten, the sun god, but he still said that Ra was Aten's father. Well, right? Would we say that, if the one God has a father, then he's not the beginning, so it's not actually qualifying as monotheism, right? Notice Xenophanes didn't say that. So what Xenophanes does not say is very significant. He doesn't say, well, the one God was descended from the Titans, or the one God was born from earth and heaven, or something like that. Like he doesn't. He just says, well, he's there. He's doing everything. Okay. So that's why Akhenaten. He was. The other thing with Akhenaten is that, remember, the Jews had spent 400 years in Egypt, so they were familiar with the religion that said there's only one God. So in that sense, it's not saying that there could be that influence, and then he's thinking, well, that's a good idea, and then I'll kind of split the difference. I'm not going to completely abandon polytheism, but I'll say that Aten is much higher than the other ones, but it's still not all the way to monotheism. Now, the other example would be Zoroastrianism. Because once again, you might find people say, oh, well, Zoroastrianism is monotheism. Like, not quite. Okay.
For example, Zoroaster elevated Ahura Mazda to status of uncreated spirit, bad deities created by Angra, Mainyu, dualistic.
Okay, so if you were to read a book on world mythology, you might come across Zoroastrianism. It's Persian. It's from the Middle East, and some scholars are like, oh, the Bible just rehashed Zoroastrianism. Well, in that sense, this is kind of relevant, right, for scripture studies. That no, Zoroastrianism was not full monotheism. See how henotheism is like a middle stage. Heno means one in Greek, so there's one God who's standing out above the others. So Ahura Mazda is the good God of Zoroastrianism, and so he does say he's uncreated. So that's definitely progress compared to polytheism, right? But on the other hand, it's dualistic. There's a good God and there's a bad God, and the bad God, Angra Mainyu, is contending with the other one, and So right, he's the one who creates the bad gods in the pantheon. So there's still a pantheon, basically. That would be one way to think of it, right? A pantheon means, there's a bunch of gods we're listing. Because you could say, oh, well, Zoroastrianism, isn't that just kind of like we have God and Satan, right? And Satan's the leader of the bad angels. Well, but there's no pantheon in Judaism or Christianity. There's not Yahweh and then this and that and the other, right? So, see what I mean? It's still not monotheism. And there's no pantheon of anyone equal to God in the Greek monotheists. So one very important point is that, like Plato's going to say, God created the gods. Okay, so what that shows that God is in a separate class from them, because if He created them, and that's where, right, when Christianity came along, well, God created the angels. There was a similarity there. So they're basically taking the Greek gods and seeing them the way we would see angels. Obviously not with the same clarity, but right. So in Zoroastrianism, there's basically a dualistic pantheon of good gods and evil gods. It's not very different from monotheism. Who's reading? Do you want to read the footnote?
Yes.
So this is regarding the word henotheism. I don't know. Actually, I don't know how it's pronounced. I've never heard anyone speak it. Henotheism.
Schelling coined this term for worship of one God along with others. My definition is based on different distinctions than his or others.
So just like if you looked it up on Wikipedia, he's the one who coined the term, and then he gives one definition of it. Other people give a different account. But you can see, for me, the key thing is whether or not that one God is actually, did he create the other gods? Is there anyone who's on a par with him or not? And really, that doesn't occur often. Okay, what do we read number 3?
Monotheism asserts one God who is eternal, omnipotent, etc. 2 times.
Okay, so see, that's what we see both in the Xenophanes and in Revelation. Okay?
Philosophical. Reason alone. For example, Xenophanes, Socrates, Aristotle, Epictetus, Plato. God created the gods.
So that's from the Timaeus. I don't give you a footnote there, but the green book, the Essential Plotinus book, Matthew has it here on his desk. There's about 30 pages of quotes from Plato in the back of that book that are really excellent. And he, I don't know if he was a priest or not, O'Brien, but anyway, he gathered the text where Plato talks about God. And when you gather them together, it's very impressive because they're scattered all over the place. If you just read Plato, you would never really encounter them together. Okay.
Reveal. Faith in divine revelation. Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
See if compare.
Compare to Islam. Parasitic on prior.
Right, so Islam is parasitic, meaning, right, they're taking Judaism and Christianity and all these different ideas that are kind of burgeoning in Arabia, which is a crossroads, and blending them together with a lot of things from their local culture blended in. So it didn't just come from nowhere, it came from the Jews and Christians who were traveling in that area that were then kind of a syncretism. Okay?
Both are compatible with speaking metaphorically of lesser, non-anthropomorphic, quote-unquote, gods, i.e. spirits, as in Scripture.
Right, so I mentioned that regarding the Psalms, right? They'll say, like, the Hebrew says God sat above the gods. So there's that inclusive monotheistic language there, right? Even in the Psalms. And that's why some scholars who I disagree when they aren't Catholic, right, will say, oh, well, there was originally Yahweh was the head of a pantheon. There's not a shred of evidence for that in Scripture. You can say that if you want to, but there's no evidence for that. You know? So that's why the problem is when there's not any evidence. There should be at least some hints of that. So when it says God reigned above the gods, the interesting thing is when they translate into Greek, they change that to God like reigns above the angels to make it clearer, to avoid the confusion. Okay?
Only revelation makes clear one should sacrifice to God alone.
Okay. All right, so let's go over. So next time we'll read the horizontal handout. So if you didn't get a chance to read that, you can read that for Monday, and then we'll go on to theories.